What's going on? My name's Brent. I'm the student pastor here. I get the opportunity to preach 3-4 times a year. John's out of town this week, so if you're a visitor, you've been here once or twice, I'm not the normal guy. So that could be a really good thing if you don't like hearing me preach. Come back next week, hear somebody better. But I like to, every time I'm up here, I feel like I have some personal story, personal connection, or something that I just share. And today I'll just throw it out. A lot of you guys know this, a lot of you may not, but I grew up a preacher's kid. If there's anybody else in the room that grew up a preacher's kid, come here after service. We'll have a support group later on, like to work through all the stuff that we had to go through as a preacher's kid. There was a lot of perks to being the pastor's kid, especially at the first church my dad was ever at, a smaller church. But it was a really cool church because downstairs was huge, and we had the coolest games ever of hide and go seek and football and just all this stuff in the church. It was like the creepiest old church ever, so we'd like go run around when it was 11 o'clock at night, running around downstairs trying to find all these old doors, all this goofy stuff. Bad news is, it had some positives but also had some negatives. Negatives would be that I never got away with a thing at church. Our church was it was a lot smaller than this, and so my dad knew exactly if I was paying attention or not. He could tell when I was like doodling or when I was playing with my cars. But then we went to another church that was bigger. My dad was on staff at a bigger church that had a balcony. And so I got to be a teenager, and I was like, I'm going to go sit in the balcony with my friends because he can't see me there. Well, he could. He always found out when I was like, I'd slip out of church when I was a teenager, or I'd do this or do that. He found out before church was over what I'd done or what I hadn't done that I should have done. Always. But I think the biggest negative ever that came from, and this doesn't just come from being a preacher's kid, but if you grew up in the church really heavily, you could probably relate with this too. But by the time I was 13, 14, 15 years old, I had church pretty much figured out. I had God figured out, at least I thought. I think if you've been in church long enough, even just several years, but if you've grown up in church your entire life, there's always aspects of church or aspects of faith that you just think you know. You think this is how God always works. This is how He's always worked in the past. It's how He's always going to work again. Or you think if I do this, He'll do that. And that's a dangerous trap that I think we can fall in our faith. And everybody thinks, even inside, outside the church, there's all these theories on God, all these traditions that we have. If you do any research or look at any like philosophy or science or stuff like that, they think we have evolution figured out, it's real, and here's how it's real. Well, it's not. It's garbage. Or they think, well, since there's this problem of evil, there's evil in the world, therefore God couldn't exist, or God messed up. Or they think because humans are fallen, that we have diseases, that we sin, we do bad things. We're like, well, God made a mistake, so God's not really who He said He was. No. And people base their entire lives on these theories that they think they've figured out on God. But even inside the church especially, we have all these traditions. Whether we acknowledge them out loud or not, we have them. We think if we work hard, God's going to bless our work. If I do it enough and I work hard enough and I'm faithful enough, God will make my ministry get bigger. He'll bless us and He'll give us salvations. He'll do all this stuff if we put in enough work. But if you read the Bible, not necessarily always that way. Or we always think, well, God's always going to punish the bad people. Like the bad person always gets caught. But if you look in the news today and look at the world today, bad things happen and people don't get punished for it. Now, eventually, once they pass and once they meet God face to face, they'll be punished. But we think here on earth, if they do something bad, they're going to get punished here because they deserve it. Or if I do something good, I'm going to get rewarded here because I deserve it. And those are totally false because they don't always line up. They don't always go out. And just as soon as we think we have God figured out, He'll throw a curveball. And He won't do it the same way. And He does that on purpose. If you look through the entire Bible, you look at Moses. When Moses had the people wandering in the desert for 40 years, and you read that whole story, and God provided. He gave them manna every morning. They were supposed to collect for that day and nothing more because they knew the next day they'd have it. And then in certain circumstances and situations, He went above and beyond in a different way. Like, for instance, there's one time where He told Moses, if you strike this rock with your staff, you'll have water. So Moses followed. He did it. There was water. The next time they needed water, Moses said, oh, this is what God told me to do once. I'm going to go do it again. Well, he does it, and he disobeys God because God said, I didn't tell you to do that this time. But he just assumed God worked this way once, he'll work this way again. But even after they stop wondering, they get Israel, they're in the promised land, they have kings, they have rulers, they have all this stuff. God has their law, and they follow the law, and they think they have God figured out. They think if I follow the rules and I don't do anything wrong, and I follow all these rules, then God will bless, God will do what I want him to do, I can manipulate my way around. But what they did is they would follow God with an impure heart and go through the motions, go through the actions. God knew the intentions of their heart, and he wouldn't bless them. He would punish them, and eventually they got so bad they quit obeying. God kicked them out of the land. But they thought, we've got God figured out. And when he didn't work the way they wanted to, he got mad, or they got mad. They would get mad at God because God didn't follow through with what they wanted, because they thought they were doing everything right. And you move forward even farther to the New Testament with Jesus and the Pharisees, and I've been reading my personal devotional life. I've been reading through the Gospels for the past, 3-4 weeks now. And as I go, most of it seems like it's interactions between Jesus and the Pharisees. They're always questioning Jesus on something, or he's always confronting them on something. And if you ever read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, the whole thing is like, you have heard this, but I tell you this. You've heard it done this way, and you think that's how it's worked, but here's the real intentions. Here's the real impact. Here's what's really going on. And Jesus throws them a curveball because they think they have God figured out. They added their own experience, their own ideas of everything, and they put that on top of God and said, this is how God works. I figured it out. We're good to go. Well, as we continue through Corinthians, we'll start in verse 18 today, and we'll work through this, the first of chapter 2. We'll figure out that we don't have God figured out. And it's a lot simpler than we make it. So let's start reading in verse 18. Chapter 1, verse 18. It says, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who believe, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Now I'll say this, start off, except for those in this room, maybe some of you in this room, people who are out and about in the community today, they think Jesus is ridiculous. They think he's absurd. And that started a long, long time ago. I've got a couple of pictures I'll show you. This was early first century church, I think. There we go. It's a carving in stone. And it reads, somebody said, I can't tell what that reads. That's because it's in a different language. But it reads, Aleximenus worships his God. First century, right after Jesus had died, you see a naked man on a cross with the head of a donkey, and this guy who's supposedly raised his hand and worshipped him. They're mocking Jesus because they think, this Jesus guy's stupid. What do you believe in? This is what they think. Jesus is a donkey. Think of the word they really use for it. They think he's something else. But it comes over today, and we take the cross not as seriously as God did. We add stuff to it, but even we make it mean a lot less by, here's some stuff I saw literally online last night. A couple more pictures. You know Jesus is in American Ninja Warrior? You ever seen that show? Somebody had that picture. They took a picture of Jesus on the cross, took him out of it, and put him in that. There's a couple more. He's in foosball table too as well. He did slip and slides. What else did he do? He also won the Tour de France. It's funny, I came here earlier today and I showed the pictures to the people around the sound booth, and Kathy told me, she goes, that's hurtful to see Jesus that way. And I think rightfully for us as believers it should be, but that's how the world views Jesus. He's foolish. You think some dude who died on a cross can fix your life today? You're nuts. And they make fun of him. That's kind of how it comes across today. But it says in the end of that verse, but to those who are being saved, he is the power of God. Jesus makes perfect sense to me because I've experienced him. I know what his grace is like. I know what Jesus' love in my life feels like, and I know that's what drives me, that's what compels me. But to somebody who doesn't, they look at some dude dying on a cross 2,000 years ago and say, you're a total idiot if that's what you believe. That's kind of how the world approaches it. But we'll keep going forward to see, like, God wasn't stupid when he did it this way. And in verse 19, Paul continues, said, it's written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Jesus was always plan A. This goes back to the Old Testament. He's quoting some Old Testament verse. God's just saying, or Paul's saying that back in the day, God said He was going to make your wisdom and your plans look dumb because His were better, and this is how He did it. So Jesus was always plan A in all of God's plans. It wasn't like, well, we screwed it up, we did some stuff to manipulate things, and we changed it. So God had to send Jesus. Jesus had to come to make for us. No, God knew this was going. When God created the world, He said, these people are going to fall, but I'm going to send my Son to redeem them because I love them. It was always plan A. Then He gets kind of sarcastic with them, verse 20. Where's the one who's wise? Where are the scribes? Where are the debaters of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? He's getting sarcastic. No human wisdom is going to trump what God does. He kind of unpacks it as he goes. And in verse 21, he says, For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Pretty much what he's saying is, this world, we can't figure God out on our own. But God said, I'm going to teach you. I'm going to send Jesus. I'm going to be the ultimate wisdom and redeem this world in a way that nobody could ever fathom. And it pleased God to do that through Jesus. And Paul also wrote, I'll read a couple verses. You can just write a note. Romans 1, it talks a lot about, I'll read some verses here, starting in verse 18. It says, For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness they suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain. So they see what God's given them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power, His divine nature, has been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and all the things that have been made. So they're without excuse. We're without excuse. God's given us Himself. He's showed us enough of Himself that we know who He is. We've distorted it. But it says we're without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor Him or give thanks to Him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of God, the glory of immortal God, for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So we got enough of God that we have no excuse. We know. But in our own wisdom, in our own thinking, we think we've outsmarted God. We figured God out. And in that, our pride and our selfishness comes through. And it goes on later to say, like, we started worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. We worshiped our own thinking, our own inventions, our own designs. We started worshiping that over God's glorious creation. We started worshiping that over Him. We turned that into our God. And the things we create tend to be pretty ungracious for the elite of the elite because we think we've earned something. If you go back through history, you look at Greek gods, all those Greek gods had to be pleased, and they were on a pedestal, but they all had a flaw. They were all fallen in one way, shape, or form, because anything we create is going to be fallen. Anything we create is going to be screwed up because we are. But we take our thinking, we put that in place of God, and we become foolish in what we think is our own wisdom. The only correct response is total belief. And he goes on to talk about, like, at that time, he said the Jews demanded signs in verse 22, and the Greeks sought wisdom. The Jews were kind of like me. They thought they had God figured out through what law He gave them and the way He'd worked in the past. They thought, okay, here's God, here's how He works. He's in this box, He's in the temple, and if we appease Him and do what He wants, we'll be okay and He won't punish us. And this is seen, an example would be if you ever read the book of Judges, you can write Judges 6, that's where this story is, the story of Gideon. If you ever heard the story of Gideon, God calls him to defeat this major army, and he's a coward, he's scared, he doesn't want to do it. So what he does is he said, God, I'm going to lay this fleece out, and if I wake up in the morning and there's dew on the fleece but nowhere else, then I'll believe it was you, and I'll believe this is what you called me to do. So he wakes up the next morning, there's dew on the fleece, nowhere else. So you'd think, okay, he believes, it's good. No, he says, wait, let's do this one more time. I'm going to throw the fleece out one more time, and in the morning, if there's dew everywhere around the fleece but not on the fleece, then we'll do it. And he kept begging for a sign, and every time God gave him one, he's like, oh, wait, there's something else, there's something else. it just totally demonstrated a lack of faith. When the Jews demanded signs and when we demand God to work in a certain way, it demands a lack of faith in ourselves that God is who He says He is, and He will do what He calls us to do. And even then, Jesus eventually kind of got tired of it. If you read the Gospels, He got tired of doing all these miracles just for the sake of somebody saying, "Well, if you're really God, you'll do this. If you're really this, you'll do this." And when one time in Matthew 12, they questioned Him, and here's His response. It says, "Some of the scribes and Pharisees answered Him, saying, 'Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you.' But He answered them, 'An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it.'" So the people of Nineveh who were saved because of what Jonah did will rise up and say, "How did you not believe?" They'll rise up and judge you because you had Jesus. It says they repented at the preaching of Jonah, but He says, "Behold, something greater than Jonah is here." The whole time Jesus was on earth, and every word in this that was ordained by God that Jesus spoke, that even Paul writes here that we're studying, this is the greatest sign you'll ever get from God. But a lot of times we try to rationalize it away. That's what they did. They said, "Oh, well, nobody is going to die and come back from the dead. That wouldn't happen. That doesn't make sense." We read those verses today and we're like, obviously that's what Jesus is talking about. And we see that He's fulfilled it, He's come through with it, but they didn't believe. The worry for me and for us here today is, I guess the warning for us really is, we better never put God in a box and tell Him He has to work this certain way or else we won't believe Him. And we do that more than we're willing to admit. For example, "Father, I'll obey you if I see this." And some people have said, "Well, if you play this certain song on the radio, I know that you're telling me something." No, that's just a lack of faith. Or if you send enough people, I can't do this by myself. You're calling me to do this great thing, and I can't. But if you send me 5 more people, then I'll do it. That's a lack of faith. That's what the Jews had. They wanted signs, they wanted works, and then they say, "Okay, I trust in that work," but they never really trusted in Jesus. They never trusted God as He called them to. And then you move on, the Gentiles, it says they demanded wisdom, which makes sense because the Greeks He was talking to here were extremely smart people. Their whole culture was built on how smart, how wise, understanding they had. So what they did is they wanted to rely on their natural strengths. They wanted to rely on what they're naturally good at, what they're gifted to do, but they're guilty of thinking they had ultimate knowledge. They're guilty of thinking, "I have all this stuff and God has to fit into my box. If God fits into my own reasoning, my own understanding, then it must be true." But Paul comes, throws them a curveball and says this. In verse 23, he says, "But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles." To say he preached Christ crucified is like total, ultimate contradiction. There's no way a Christ, a Savior, would ever be crucified. Just like in my world, there's no way there's ever such thing as like tasty vegetables. Contradiction. There's no such thing. But some contradictions are good, like fried ice cream. You ever had fried ice cream? I love fried things, love ice cream, put them together. It's like heavenly. That's kind of like Jesus. You put that together, it's heavenly. But the Messiah, the Christ that they thought, that carried the weight of like victory and triumph and winning, pretty much. Power. And then crucifixion carried the notion of weakness and humility, like humiliation and defeat. And Jesus died on a cross, which to the Gentiles, he died a state criminal, a man who was stupid and lowly and nobody would ever believe him. And to the Jews, he died a cursed man because in the Old Testament law it said whoever hangs on a tree is cursed by God. So they wouldn't understand. That's why he said he was a stumbling block and he was the folly to them. So he lined up in today's society. He lined up on death row next to people like John Wayne Gacy, Timothy McVeigh, all these terrorists that are out, and Jesus is right there next to him. So their culture said, why would you ever believe and trust in a guy like him? Which in our own thinking makes sense. But it says that he only taught He said, we came preaching Christ and Christ crucified. And here's the point in this section here is the message of the gospel is really simple. And it's simple on purpose. Because the whole point of the gospel is to exalt Jesus and the work he did on the cross. That was the point. The entire reasoning for all of that. I said it was simple. I didn't say it was shallow. It's deeper than anything that we could ever do. It's deeper than this whole book could ever explain. But it is simple. But even though it's deep, it's not like unobtainable. We can't like not grasp it because it's so deep. We can grasp it because it's so simple, but it's so deep that we could never exhaust it. We could read this book. We could preach the gospel every week, which hopefully you hear that every week when you hear us preach. We could preach it every week and shed a new light on who Jesus is, because it's so deep. The fault sometimes we fall into with that is, I've heard people who've been Christians for a long time say, well, I've heard about Jesus, I want to go deeper. I want to like really study Revelation and like Daniel and all these prophets and all this blah, blah, this stuff. And to go deeper and to forget about Jesus is not to go deeper at all. It's to run away from God, not run to him. When you read books like Revelation and all these books that are really tough to understand, you should read that through the lens of how's Jesus at work. Where do I see Jesus in Revelation? Where do I see him in the book of Daniel, in the book of Ezekiel, and all these books that are like really hard? Because if you don't read it through that lens, then you've gone off the grid. You've gone too deep away from what the gospel gives. Keep reading verse 24 and 25. It says, But to those who are called, both Jew and Greek, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than man, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Paul's point here is not to show how smart the cross was, but to show that it worked. That Christ was ultimate power. And he really was ultimate wisdom. God knew what he was doing when he sent Jesus. He doesn't need our opinion on it. But if really, we could have come up with a smarter plan. We could have come up with a more powerful plan to attract certain people to Jesus. But the problem with that is that eventually, someday, people are going to want something different. And then we're going to have to change our plan. We're going to have to change our message. So the message that we would come up with would ultimately fail. But God, in ultimate wisdom, knowing everything that he knew, he said, this is the best way. This is the only way. And through that, we would come up with it, but our plans would never accomplish what he's did. Our plans are directly in contradiction to his, but his plans accomplish what we want done. His plans give us a way. His plans give us hope that we never would have had outside of it. And then keep moving forward. He moves on from just like the message of the cross. He moves on to the people who receive it. He's talking to the Corinthians, and he says in verse 26, he says, Consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many powerful. Not many were of noble birth. He's saying you're the evidence. If the gospel works on you, it can work on anybody pretty much. So he's kind of like, chopping their legs out from under them a little bit. Don't get too high and mighty, because think about who you are, really. But God used no criteria when he called. He used no criteria to say, okay, if you're of this level, if you're of this status, then you can be a Christian. He goes to the lowly of lows and says, look who you are, but I can still save you anyways. And the cool thing was, especially in early Christianity, I think we can see this some in the church today too, is Christianity is the only thing that really cuts all social standards. If you think of the world today, you've got to be like financially elite to be in the social circles of some people, or like physically talented enough to be in athletics, and you're running those social circles. But with Christianity, you bring nothing to the table, and you're a part of the group. And that's what he's telling them there. And the irony is he's going to kind of reveal to us, the Corinthians were saved by grace, and they were of lowly standards. But then they want to take this other standard and apply it to other people and say, well, you can't be a part of us unless you're this way. So he's reminding them, don't think you're above anything. Don't think you're beyond anybody. And oftentimes in history, when well-to-do people were in charge of the church, they screwed it up. Like when in 300 AD, when Constantine took over, and he was the king, but he was also the ruler of the church, he made everybody a Christian and baptized everybody whether they wanted it or not. because he was powerful enough to do that. What did that do? That diluted the church and took the power out of it. Because if you bring most of the people into the church who aren't Christians and put them in leadership roles, how are they going to lead the church when they're not a Christian? That can't happen. So a lot of times throughout history, when those powerful, those well-to-do people have been in charge, it just goes down the tubes because they start relying on their own strengths, their own wisdom, and it goes bad. But that kind of comes back in the first century. You saw that carving earlier where they made fun of Christians. Here's a quote from another early guy during the early church talking bad about Christianity. He said, "Let no one educated, no one wise, or no one sensible draw near. By the fact that they themselves admit that anybody is worthy of their God, they show that what they want, that they are only able to convince the foolish, the dishonorable, and the stupid." That's what they thought of Christianity, because we would accept anyone. But what this guy saw as weakness, Paul sees it as like ultimate strength. That it doesn't take anything to come to Jesus, but he'll save you anyways. He's the only one that has the power to do it. But the world outside saw it as the church is just weak because they'll take anybody. He doesn't take anything to be a part of them. But by taking the gospel to anybody who's broken, helpless, in a dishonorable situation, God totally overthrew the standards of the world, and he showed himself as high and mighty and supreme. Second point being the recipients of the gospel. They're nothing extraordinary. They're nothing spectacular to show that God's grace covers all sinners. If God only saved the elite, then it would look like, well, I've got to be to this status before God will do anything for me. Move on to verse 27. It says, "But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are." It's not demeaning the Corinthians or us that he chose us. We're foolish, we're nothing. But all it does is that exalts what God can do. If God can take nothing and make a church, if God can take people of low standards and low anything, and he can do that with anybody, then he can do it with them, then he can do it with anybody. It doesn't mean somebody has to bring something to the table. In verse 29, it says, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. Here's something. The cross that he keeps talking about, he preached the cross and only the cross. I read a note this week, and it said the cross at the level. I'm not even going to try and do it. I'm just going to read it. The ground is level at the foot of the cross, which I thought was simple, yet it was kind of profound. And nothing that we bring to Jesus is going to give us any advantage over anybody else. We can't be smart enough that Jesus is going to like us more. We can't be influential enough that he'll like us more. We can't be nice enough. We can't work hard enough that Jesus will like us more. Nothing. None of that works. But only trusting in Christ and his cross, that's all that matters. The final two verses here in this section, verse 30 and 31, it says, and because of him, you're in Christ. Because of what he's done, then you're in Christ. He called you. He put you there. Christ, who became the wisdom of God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Just as we've received this ourselves, we should look for ways to boast, to communicate. That's what he's saying. If you're going to brag about something in this world, it better be about Jesus. And as I read these verses, here's a personal conviction for me is when people come to me and think of me, I want them to think of me more as a Christian than like a Tennessee football fan. Even though I do love football and it's fun and I love watching it, if I boast and brag more about football than I do about Jesus, something's wrong inside of me, because it says we're only supposed to boast in him. But as we receive this ourselves, we should look for ways, the central truth that Christ came, he died, he rose again, we should look for ways to communicate that to others. We're to boast in him. We're to proclaim Jesus to those around us. So if you've received the gospel, you're now a messenger of the gospel. You think, well, I'm not a pastor, I'm not this. Yeah, but your life is a message for what the gospel's done. And you're either a good messenger or a bad messenger. There's not an option to not be one. If somebody knows you're a Christian and they see how you live and it doesn't line up, then you're a bad messenger. It's not that you can like withdraw your name and say, well, I'm not a messenger. No, yeah, you are. So you have the option to be a good messenger or a bad messenger. And that's kind of what he moves on to talk about, the very first part of chapter 2. And I'll wrap this up really, really quick. But he spells out how you do ministry. Verse 1, he says, "And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom." Here's what he did. He didn't allow himself to get caught up in trying to follow these signs that they wanted. He didn't let himself get caught up in this wisdom and all this philosophy speech that he could have. But he had a simple message, and he kept it simple. You ever heard like the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid? That's what he did. He kept it simple. He didn't let himself get too engrossed in what they wanted. He just kept his message the same because he knew that's where the power was. Because if you try to change the message or alter it to fit somebody that wants it, you're essentially taking any effectiveness and any work out of the gospel that Jesus had and saying, like, he's not good enough, so I've got to add something to it so they'll want it. And that doesn't work. Because eventually they might believe it at the time, but eventually they flame out because they find out what the truth is and it doesn't line up with what you told them. So Paul knew that. And then he says, "I came, for I decided to know nothing among you except Christ and Him crucified." Not that Paul was an idiot about everything, but he said, this is going to be my singular passion in life, Jesus and His cross and the work it did for you. That's what my life's going to be about. As messengers of the gospel, as believers in the gospel, that's what our life is to be about. We're to be those people who know Jesus and Him crucified, and our passion should be centered in that. Verse 3, he said, "And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. In my speech, and my message were not of plausible words or wisdom." Wait. It says, "And I was with you in weakness and fear and much trembling." Let's stop there. He was weak on purpose. Paul was a genius. He was a scholar of the law. But he decided, you know what, I'm just going to come and I'm only going to preach Jesus. I don't want them to follow me. I want them to follow Jesus. Later on in Corinthians, he says that. I want you to follow Christ because I follow Him. And the key is Paul didn't rely on that, but he could have. He intentionally avoided what they were wanting. He intentionally avoided what fascinated them. They were fascinated by all these signs and all this wisdom. And he said, I'm not going to go there. I'm only going to talk about Jesus. Because if I go there, then they'll follow that, but they won't follow Jesus. And I think on a personal note, verse 3, Paul talking about being a messenger of the gospel. I think if you spend any time around us as staff, Paul said he came not knowing anything. And if you spend any time around us as staff, we don't know much either. Whether it's John, Paul, myself, Scott, like we're nothing special. Paul said he wasn't anything special. If you spend any time around us, really, like, there's nothing really that special about us. And there's certain days where I get up and I come to work and I'm like, man, I can't do this. Like, I'm not equipped to lead all these people. I'm not good at that. And I'm not. Or if you're a ministry leader here and you help run a ministry or help do something, there's probably days where you show up to a Awana or youth group or to lead your small group and you're like, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, I just feel like I can't do it on my own. And the truth is you can't. Or if you're just a volunteer and you just come and you're an Awana listener or you follow the group around or you come and you serve and you make coffee, you're like, well, they don't need me around, and the truth is we don't. But Jesus has empowered you to come in weakness and to serve. That's what Paul did. That's what we try to do as a church, as believers. We're called to do that. And in Luke 14, Jesus said, for anyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Paul humbled himself. And it wasn't that he was exalted here on earth, but when he gets to heaven and he gets the reward of a faithful life and eternity with Jesus, that's being exalted. And today, as we live our lives and as we look to how can I be a servant, how can I follow Christ, His example, Paul's example, how can I do that? We can serve. We can be humble. The final two verses here are this. It says, and my speech and message were not of plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith may not rest on wisdom of men, but on the power of God. And the third point is, the messengers of the gospel, they come in weakness. Whether you're a worker in a ministry, you lead a ministry, whatever it is, we come in weakness. Whether it's going to your neighbor to tell them about Christ, you come in weakness because you want to demonstrate that the Spirit is the power, not you. The emphasis is on the Spirit's work to transform lives. He can minister through your weakness, and only Him. He can change hearts. He can draw those people who are far from God close to God, but I can't. The purpose of Jesus giving us the Holy Spirit in our lives today as believers is not so that we can just simply endure this world and live on a higher plane, but He gives us the Spirit to empower us to live with intentions of spreading the gospel where we are. We have a mission as believers to do that, and we do it through humility. We do it in weakness because we want God to look good. We want people to really see the message, and if we add our own strengths in what we try to do and just rely solely on that, that's when Jesus gets cloudy. Other people don't see Jesus because they see how awesome you are. They don't see how awesome Jesus is. So when you serve, when you come, we're called to come in weakness. And the goal here is this. God wants He wants to disarm us. He wants to take our weapons away. Any wisdom that we have, any strength, any power, any abilities of our own, He wants us to come. He wants to take those out of our hands and force us to come to Him totally empty-handed. We can't bring anything to Him. And if we come to Him empty-handed and we fully trust in Him alone, we embrace that, that's when He gives us the power. That's when we have true strength. But also, coming back to the purpose of 1 Corinthians, that's when we're unified as a church. That's what he's going to keep talking about here. We have to have unity as a church, and the only way we can have unity is if we all empty-handed. If we all come to Jesus empty-handed and say, it can't be me, it must be you. And it's got to be you in whatever we do. If we come to Him that way, that's when the church has unity. And the bottom line across it all is the cross is going to unite all believers under God's grace to save us, but also His authority in our lives to lead us. So remember this: if you can never leave your initial belief in the gospel, in Jesus dying for your sins, being raised from the grave, sitting on the throne in heaven right now, you can never leave that message, because as soon as you do, then you've walked away. You've let your faith grow stale till you think there's something more out there. The gospel should always be in the front of our minds, whether it be when we're at work in the morning, or tomorrow afternoon when we go to the gym, or when we're at our kids' sporting events, or when we're at family functions, or when we're at home with our families. The gospel has to be in the front of our minds. It has to be our sole purpose, our sole passion. And out of that, God's glorified. Not, how can I do this? How can I do this relying on my own strengths? But if we seek to share God through that, totally focused on Him all the time, that's when God works. We come to Him in weakness. We come to Him empty-handed and say, it's got to be you, because I can't do it. We're going to kind of close the service different today. So if you're helping out with communion, you guys can go ahead and head to the back. But right now, I want us to focus solely on what the gospel is. Solely on what Paul preached: Christ and Him crucified. The work Jesus did. So if you're a believer, I want you to focus on Jesus. Remember that Jesus is the ultimate wisdom and the ultimate power that overcomes your sin. It overcomes what the world throws at you. And if you're not a believer in the room today, and you're sitting here while we take communion as a church, here's what I want you to think of. Ask yourself these questions: is Jesus enough? Because in reality, He is. But do you believe that? And what is it going to take for me to trust Him? I pray that it's not, I want Jesus to perform a sign, or it has to make sense. It has to be this wisdom thing. Because if it is, it won't last. But I pray that you see God's truth, you see God's work, you see His grace to bring people who don't deserve it to Him. And so as we go through communion today, if you're not a believer, here's a prayer you could pray. You could say, God, please show me your grace. Help me come to you empty-handed and receive Jesus. As we focus on that today, here's what we're going to do. So as the guys come and as they take the bread, I want that to be your focus moment. Focus on Jesus' work and what He did in the cross.